Hey, Doc Steve here, and I recently put out 3 videos on the why, the what, and the how of fact-checking. And that's because I believe that we have a new pandemic in this country, the pandemic of misinformation, which is threatening to destroy our country. And I believe that the antidote to misinformation is developing a culture of fact-checking. And what I mean by a culture of fact-checking is that when somebody hears something really weird online, or they hear a politician saying something that's very partisan, their first thought is, well, that's really interesting. I wonder what's really true about that. And they decide to do the work of fact checking. And I talk about how to do that in those first 3 videos, so please take a look at those. But in this video, I wanted to take a couple examples from the last election cycle in order to show you how important it is for this fact checking to be happening. Now, in this last election cycle, the stats show that lots and lots of people voted for the Republicans because of the economy, and especially because of consumer prices. But the fact is, if a lot of those people had been fact-checking, they might have had some second thoughts about doing that. And that's because if President Trump actually does what he said he was going to do in 2 main areas, namely tariffs and immigration, well, it's going to be either bad or horrible or disastrous for the economy, depending on how much of what he actually said he wants to do, he's actually successful in doing. Now, President Trump said multiple times during the campaign, and literally I just heard him say it again less than 2 weeks ago, that tariffs are going to enrich the American people at the expense of other countries to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, if you were fact-checking, you would know that other countries don't pay tariffs. Tariffs do hurt other countries, but through their economy, not because they have to pay them. I would challenge anyone out there to find me one single actual economist who's going to tell you that other countries are going to pay tariffs. Now, I've also heard that tariffs are a tax on the American people, and they're not actually really a tax. The IRS is not going to come to your door and say,
I'm here for the tariff tax.
So the question is, if the American people aren't paying it and other countries aren't paying it, well, who's paying for these tariffs? And the answer is importers pay tariffs. I want to give you a specific example. So if, for example, Walmart wants to sell, for example, Joe Biden bobblehead dolls, and just so you know I'm not being partisan, Donald Trump bobblehead dolls or Kamala Harris bobblehead dolls. And they look around and they see that the cheapest bobbleheads they can get in this country are from Baltimore, and they cost about $1.25 per bobblehead. But then they start looking around overseas and they find that they can import them for only 80 cents from the Barbados. And they can sell these to the American people for about $1 a bobblehead, whereas if they use the Baltimorean company, they're probably going to have to charge more like $1.35 or 40. Now, they might decide to go with the Baltimore ones because of quality issues, and I can tell you as a patriotic American, Baltimorean bobbleheads bobble better than Barbadian bobbleheads bobble. Say that 10 times fast.
Baltimore bobbleheads bobble better than Barbadian bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore bobbleheads bobble better than Barbadian bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore bobbleheads bobble better than Barbados bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore bobble.
3 times is enough. But it's quite likely that most Americans don't even know that
Baltimore and bobbleheads bobble better than Barbadian bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore and bobbleheads bobble better than bobble. But stop!
Most of them don't really care about the quality. They just want a cheap bobblehead. And Walmart knows that, so they're going to go with a Barbadian bobblehead and sell them for $1 a piece. Now, if President Trump places a 25% tariff on Barbados, then all of a sudden, Walmart has to pay the 80 cents for the bobblehead, but then pay 20 cents to the American government for the tariff. So it's going to actually cost them $1 per bobblehead. So they're going to have to sell those to the American people for more like $1.20. Now, at this point, they might decide, again, about the quality issue and decide to go with the Baltimorean ones because
Baltimore and bobbleheads bobble better than Barbadian bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore. Stop!
in which case you'll be paying a lot more because now they're getting them for $1.25 and selling them for $1.40. So you're going to be paying more for those bobbleheads, and this is going to be true for pretty much anything that President Trump puts a tariff on. So you can see this isn't really a tax, but what I like to call it is a non-tax tax burden. It is a tax burden because you and I are paying money to the federal government for stuff that we purchase through an import company. So not a tax, but it kind of functions like a federal sales tax. And if you know anything about sales taxes, they're regressive taxes, which means they hit people at the lower end of the economic spectrum a lot harder than the upper end. And that's because people at the lower end, working class, middle class people, spend a lot higher proportion of their income on daily consumer purchases than rich folks do. Now, if the only thing that President Trump is putting tariffs on are things like yachts and Lamborghinis and diamond and sapphire studded tiaras, well, then basically the rich are going to shoulder that new tax burden. But unfortunately, it's everyday stuff that everyday people buy and use pretty much every day, which means that if you're an everyday person, you're going to be paying this to the federal government, not every day, but lots of days. So the critical question is, how much does this affect everyday people? Well, different organizations have tried to estimate how much President Trump's initial tariffs in his first term have affected the American households in this country. It's not an easy calculation to make because you think you can just take the amount of tariffs and actually divide it by the number of households in the country, but it's not that easy because we're actually paying more than the actual tariffs because some retailers are going to shift to the Baltimore and Bobblehead Company because
Baltimore and bobbleheads bobble better than Barbade and bobbleheads bobble. Baltimore and bobbleheads bobble better than... Help me, please, help me.
so the total amount extra that Americans are actually paying is going to be more than that tariff amount. So the estimates from different economic organizations are that the tariffs that President Trump put on in his first term cost the average American household between $200 and $400 annually. And we're still paying those because President Biden didn't actually reverse those tariffs. So it's a real fact to say that some of the increased prices that people have had over the last couple of years started with President Trump's first term. So the even more critical question is, how much are the current planned tariffs going to affect the American people? So right now, all he's done is some extra tariffs on China, and he's proposed 25% on both Mexico and Canada. But during the campaign, and since then, he's proposed 10% across the board tariffs every single country and 60% on China. And if you were fact checking during the campaign, you would know that multiple organizations estimated what the cost to the American people would be if he actually gets that. And those came from right-leaning all the way over to left-leaning economic organizations, and the range was $1,900 to $3,500 annual cost to the average American household experienced through increased consumer prices. I want to give you another example of the cost of tariffs to the American people. The proposed 25% tariff on Canada, if you were fact-checking, you would know that that was likely to increase the average cost of a gallon of gas by 50 cents during the off-season and 80 cents in the summer season. Fortunately, right now, those are on hold, and somebody's actually talked some sense into President Trump because the proposed tariff on the crude oil has dropped to 10%, which is going to be more like 20 cents per gallon and maybe 35 cents in the summer season. But you can see these things are not going to have a small effect on the American people. Now, I think that there are good reasons for tariffs, but you got to remember that American people are paying for them through those import companies. It's not coming from other countries. So you got to make sure you got good reasons. Now, the stated reasons for the Canada and Mexico tariffs are two things: fentanyl coming into the country and undocumented immigrants coming into the country. Full disclosure, I'm leaving fact-checking now and I'm going to my opinion. I think those are dumb reasons for these tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I think there's better ways of handling those problems than slapping tariffs on those two countries. The second thing is, I don't actually think that's the real reason. I think it's a stated reason, but I don't think it's a real reason. I want to tell you why, and this is based on real fact-checking. The amount of fentanyl that comes in through the northern border is under 1%, and the amount of undocumented immigration that comes from that border is under 2%. So we are double whammying the American people. And yes, I know double whammy is not a verb, but I like it. I'm using it that way. I don't care what you think. We're double whammying the American people, and we're single whammying the Canadian people for a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of that problem. It just doesn't make sense to me. The cynic in me, back to opinion now, is that the real reason for these tariffs is to shift more of the tax burden in this country from the rich to the middle class and the working class. That's the cynic in me. The optimist in me is saying that, well, there's some other reason, but I have no idea what it is. I got one more opinion for you. I already pointed out that we're double whammying the American people for these tariffs. We are single whammying Canada for these tariffs, and we're also single whammying Mexico for these tariffs. And I want to point out something, that Mexico and Canada and the Canadian and the Mexican people have been some of our best friends on the international stage for decades. Yes, I know the small matter of the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, but that's why I said decades, not centuries. Give me a break. So they can't actually be called BFF, but they can be called BFFD, best friends for decades. And are you nasty to your best friends? Well, I hope not. And maybe as a nation, we shouldn't be nasty to our best friends either. So that's some fact checking on the direct costs of tariffs to the American people. There's another whole category here of indirect costs, and that has to do with the fact that when a country like the US puts a tariff on another country, they usually put tariffs back. So I'm not going to get into that, but that's another whole side of this. It's much harder to calculate the effect that that's going to have for the American people than it is for those direct costs. So fact checking about tariffs took a long time. So I'm going to be actually doing a second video on the effects of immigration policy on our economics and on the American household. So stay tuned for that. If you haven't seen my 3 videos on the why, the what, and the how of fact checking, please check those out at Doc Steve, all one word, on YouTube. So thanks for watching. Until next time, go out and double whammy somebody. Actually, don't do that. That's kind of mean. But it's now a verb. Feel free to use it. See you next time.